Well, this is the book. I actually got this book last week, and I was so excited to get it. It's better than I expected, pretty much because after working on a book for many years, and sometimes one can't believe that this book actually can exist in real life. And this is a beautifully designed book. The book cover is designed by queer filmmaker and artist Sinophone, which I'm going to introduce in a minute. So on the right-hand side, you'll see Sinophone and her partner Ming working on a camera. They are filmmakers and they work together on many films together, including Women 15 Minutes, 女人50分钟, which are analyzed in chapter 2 of Queer China. They have also collaborated on some art projects, including paintings and photography, etc. And the book cover, this beautiful book cover, is one of Shinou's artworks called Mandarin Duck and Butterfly Series, 鸳鸯蝴蝶系列, Zhuangzhou Dreams of a Butterfly, 庄周梦蝶. Those who are familiar with classical Chinese and modern Chinese literature will immediately recognize the reference. So I chose this picture. Well, it's a beautiful picture for sure, and it has homoerotic elements in it. But most importantly, this picture captures what I call metamorphosis or post-socialist metamorphosis. In my book, Queer China, I use post-socialist metamorphosis as a theoretical framework to describe a kind of cultural production and identity formation in contemporary China in the post-Mao era. So the term is actually pretty straightforward. So it is used to describe the transformation, a process of transformation, a becoming rather than being, and it functions on two levels. The first level is a societal level, so which refers to the dramatic social changes in China's post-Mao and post-socialist era. And the second level is at the individual level, how individual desires, genders, sexualities, and identities have been changed or have been shaped by individual and societal circumstances. It is a connection between this societal level and individual level that attracts me the most. So therefore, throughout this book, I'm trying to delineate the different ways where those two levels, where those two processes of transformation are manifested and negotiated. To do so, I turn to literary and cultural works, such as films, literature, contemporary art, well, probably sometimes not even contemporary art. For example, paper cutting. Paper cutting is a traditional Chinese art used to practice in Chinese villages. And performances, including both performance art and theatrical performances. So the focus on art and literature is, in a way, actually important because in the past, queer China studies and queer Sinophone studies have focused primarily on sociological and anthropological research into queer lives in China. And my last book was about queer activism in China. And after finishing that book, I've realized that, in fact, we need to rethink some of the key concepts, such as activism. What is activism in the Chinese and Sinophone context? And somebody say that in the PRC, there's no political activism because the kind of pride parade and coming out politics, etc., are not that common or are usually working under serious political constraints. And there are only, according to some people, so queer activities or queer cultural productions. And my argument is those queer cultural productions are important forms of activism, what I call cultural activism. And these kind of soft activism function as important ways of political engagement. They help with community building, identity formation, and articulation of certain gender, sexuality, and political politics. So they should be given due attention. This book's focus is therefore on the cultural production in the PRC since the 1980s, with a focus on the post-2000 cultural sphere. So the examples that I have chosen, I've chosen 7 case studies, including queer films, documentaries, and theatrical performances, contemporary art, etc. And in this book, I'm trying to argue for the importance of culture in identity formation, community building, and social activism. And more importantly, I challenge the kind of identity politics were usually used in social movements and activism studies. So yes, identities are important. However, we should also be reflexive about identities and disentangle identities in specific ways. And those forms of cultural production, it seems to me, are important because they not only represent identities or articulations of desires, these constructions of identities are often not so static, and there are always ways to untangle those identities, or those identities have moments of disruption and dissipation. So it is those moments of disentanglement and dissipation that really attracts me. So that's what I see as the kind of the role of art, literature, and cultural production in helping us thinking about identities and politics. The book is divided into 4 parts. So they pretty much follows a chronological order, but there are also, twists and turns. And I'm using, broadly, I'm using a Deleuzean framework to trace the kind of emergence of identities and desires and its articulation in kind of national, regional, transnational, and urban contexts, and see how those becomings have taken on certain forms at a particular historical moment, and how those historical moments are always unstable, and they have potentials, actually, they embody potentials for identities to be deconstructed or to be reformulated. So the case studies that I've chosen include, of course, the first chapter is a historical chapter which traces the emergence of gay identity and queer desires in medical, sociological, and legal discourses in the 1980s to 90s. I remember that when I met Howard for the first time in 2008 at Harvard, at the Harvard East Asia Conference, I presented this chapter. So, well, about 10 years have passed. So that's the first chapter, which is a historical background. And the second chapter is analysis of Shi Tou's documentary, Women 15 Minutes. This film for me is quite interesting because it is a film that documents different forms of women's lives. And the author, the filmmaker, because of the filmmaker's queer subject position and queer perspectives, and a lot of queer moments are captured in the film. So this film is really about identifying the kind of queer women's desires in the feminist discourses in post-socialist China. There are different discourses about women, including 女性,女人, 妇女, and so on. So amongst all this proliferation of feminist discourses, queer desire was kind of imagined and discovered and represented in documentary films. The second section analyzes 2 stories. Probably most of you are familiar with the first story, which is Beijing story, later adapted into a film called 蓝雨. And then there's also a kind of Supergirl fan fiction story called Pink Affairs, 绯色事. And this story is also pretty interesting because it portrays a kind of homoerotic love story between two Supergirl contestants. Of course, it's a fan fiction. But what attracts me about those two case studies or about those two stories are that the first, there is a kind of anti-essentialist notion of identities. Both characters or protagonists actually come to their gay identities or lesbian identities through historical contexts, through encounters with kind of historical circumstances. And what's also interesting is that they all manifest the kind of structure feeling in China, in the 2000 China at the time, which articulates certain desires, including transnational imagination, middle-class dream, and so on. So it is those desires actually that embody potentials for queer desires to be articulated. And then the third part, and the third part documents two urban engagements. So the first, chapter 5 is about Fan Pepe's documentary, which documents a same-sex wedding event in the center of Beijing. So this event is interesting because it's actually a kind of flash mob type of activism, so which helps us think about what forms of visibility, coming out, and representational politics in terms of gay identity in relation to urban space. But the characters in this film or in this chapter are pretty much middle-class, urban, young Chinese. And they form a strong contrast with the characters portrayed in Mu Cao's poems. Mu Cao is a migrant worker who migrated from his home province to Beijing and doing odd jobs here and there. In his spare time, he wrote poems and published novels. His recent novel was translated into English and by Scott Myers and published. So what's interesting about his film, about his poems, is that his poems portray kind of working class and migrant lives that have not been given much attention in Chinese and Sinophone queer studies to date. And those two case studies form a strong contrast and juxtaposition to showcase the different identities, desires who occupy different spaces in a kind of dramatic process of China's urbanization and neoliberal transformation. And the last section, queer migration, focuses on queer articulations in a transnational and translocal context. Chapter 7 analyzes a documentary film which documents a kind of drag show performance in Shanghai performed by some expats. And those expats are often actually marginalized in their own countries. When they come to Shanghai, they form a kind of close bond drag community and enacted a kind of queer minor transnationalism. Well, Chapter 8, which is about the queer paper cutting artist Xi Yade, he transformed from a farmer to a queer artist, which is an interesting process. And if we analyze his biography, we'll see that actually transnational LGBT movement and international market, art market, and international capital has a big role to play in his transformation of identities. But we can also see that art and artistic engagement also allows him certain types of queer autonomy or agency in reshaping and refashioning his own identities and lives. So overall, all those case studies have documented different forms of queer becomings, and those different forms of queer becomings are closely intertwined with China's social changes in the post-socialist era, and in particular after China's entry into the WTO. And the appendix of this book documents queer events from 1981 to 2019. It's actually probably the most time-consuming chapter that was a section I've spent, but I hope that this chronology will be helpful to historians and queer community members. So this book has some resources, including on its publisher's website, it has a kind of companion web page. Well, basically, when you go to the website and click on this ugly picture or whatever, Hongwei Bao, and learn more about, and there will be some interviews, articles, and news and updates, videos related to the event. So you're welcome to use it in your teaching and learning if necessary. And the Routledge, the publisher, also provides a kind of voucher. If people want to buy kind of Queer China, then you can use this voucher and discount code FLR40 to get a 20% discount. So that's all for my presentation. Thanks very much.